So first, does the UK play any role of importance here? Second, does the European Union play any role of importance here as a set of institutions or as an individual institution? And finally, the United Nations. Some have been asking where Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, is in all of this. Do you think it matters what he does? So the UK, EU, UN, do they play any role of importance in this situation?
Well, let's talk about the UK first, and we could pick any European country, including Germany and France as well. The Russians don't want to negotiate with the Germans. They don't want to negotiate with the French, and they don't want to negotiate with the British because they understand full well that the United States runs the show. And the British will do what the United States asks them to do. So you could have perfunctory conversations with the British, but it really doesn't matter. And that's why the Russians want to talk to the United States. And the Russians don't even want to talk to NATO. They don't want to talk to Stoltenberg. They want to talk to the United States. They want to talk to Joe Biden because they know that the Europeans basically do what the Americans ask them to do. And if there's any country that does what the Americans ask them to do almost axiomatically, it's Britain. The Germans and the French sometimes resist, as we know from the Iraq War in 2003. But Tony Blair was a mere cheerleader for the United States in that war. So Britain does not have much of a role to play here. The United States is the key player. I don't say that because I'm an American. And indeed, I think American policy is usually so foolish these days that it would be better if the United States had less influence. And it would be better if the Europeans, especially the Germans and the French, stood up to the Americans. With regard to the EU, it's very important to understand that it's not just NATO expansion that is designed to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. It's NATO expansion, EU expansion, and the color revolution, the Orange Revolution, the movement to democratize Ukraine. Because you understand, just on the democratic point, the democratization point, the Russians fear that what we will do is then have a color revolution in Russia itself. If you go to Beijing, you go to Moscow. In both places, the leadership lives in fear that the United States will try to foster a color revolution inside China or inside Russia, right? So democratization, EU expansion, and NATO expansion are the three key elements of the strategy, although NATO expansion is the key. So the EU does matter here. There's no question about that, Tom. But the EU is, again, not much of a player. NATO's not much of a player. It's the United States that is driving this train. And let me make one more point on that before I talk about the UN. It's very important to understand that at the April 2008 Bucharest summit, Germany and France were adamantly opposed to any movement to make Ukraine a member of NATO. Because Germany, and here we're talking about Angela Merkel, much to her credit, understood that this was asking for serious trouble. But it was the Americans who, as always, prevailed. And at the end of the Bucharest summit, a statement was issued at the Americans' insistence that said that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO. So the Europeans, and here we're talking about the French and the Germans, they understood that this was a foolish thing to do. But they failed to stand up to the Americans, as is so often the case with the Europeans. Now, finally, you ask about the UN. The UN is effectively useless, and for one very simple reason: the Russians have a veto. Right? Anytime there's a dispute between countries that have a vote on the Security Council, and this obviously includes Russia and the United States, the UN is not going to be very meaningful, simply because the Russians would veto anything that they didn't like, and the Americans would veto anything that they didn't like. So this is, bottom line, Tom, a problem that has to be solved by the United States and the Russians.